You grew up in a world that no longer exists, and you came of age in a world that wasn't built for you. If you were born between 1981 and 1991, you've spent your life holding contradictions that never quite made sense until you understand what your brain was actually trying to do. You remember a time before the internet, but you also can't imagine life without it. You grew up writing notes on paper, but you're fluent in every social platform. You were raised with the promise that hard work equals stability, but you've watched that promise collapse in real time. You're old enough to feel nostalgic for a slower world, but young enough to be exhausted by how fast everything moves now. And somewhere in the middle of all that, you learn to hold two contradictory truths at once. You're adaptable, but you're also tired. You're optimistic, but you don't trust the system. You're connected, but you feel alone. If you were born between 1981 and 1991, your psychology was shaped by a very specific kind of whiplash. You grew up in one world and came of age in another, and your brain is still processing the gap. This isn't about generational labels. It's about what happens to the mind when the rules change halfway through the game, when the tools you were given don't match the world you're living in. When you're told to be one thing, but survival requires you to be something else entirely. You're not confused. You're not stuck. Your brain is doing exactly what it was designed to do: adapt to a world that won't stop shifting. Let's talk about what that actually looks like. You were raised on delayed gratification. Do your homework, get good grades, go to college, work your way up. The formula was clear, the timeline was predictable, and for a while it worked, or at least it seemed like it would. But by the time you entered the workforce, the economy had rewritten itself. Jobs that promised security disappeared. Entry-level positions required 5 years of experience. Student loans became inescapable. And the advice you were given, work hard, stay loyal, climb the ladder, suddenly felt like instructions for a game that no longer existed. So your brain adapted. It learned to plan and improvise at the same time, to hustle without burning out, to hope without expecting anything. You developed a psychological flexibility that older generations didn't need and younger ones take for granted. You learned to hold stability and uncertainty in the same breath. But that flexibility comes with a cost, because when you're constantly adjusting, you never fully land. You're always a little bit between things, between optimism and cynicism, between trying and giving up, between believing in the future and preparing for it to disappoint you. This is what psychologists call ambiguous loss, the grief of something that was promised but never delivered. And your generation has been living in it for decades. You remember what it felt like to be unreachable, to leave the house without a phone, to make plans and trust that people would show up, to be bored without it being a problem, to have privacy without having to fight for it. But you also remember the shift, the slow creep of connectivity, the way social media arrived not as a revolution but as a convenience. MySpace, then Facebook, then Instagram, then everything else. You didn't grow up with it, but you grew into it. And because of that, you have a relationship with technology that's neither native nor resistant. You're fluent, but you're also aware of what was lost. Your brain developed during a time when identity was still somewhat private, when you could try on different versions of yourself without an audience, when mistakes didn't follow you forever. But by the time you reached adulthood, all of that had changed. Suddenly, everything was visible, documented, permanent. So you learn to curate, to perform, to manage multiple versions of yourself across different platforms. And while younger generations assume this is just how life works, you remember when it wasn't. You remember when you could exist without being perceived. And that memory creates a psychological tension. You want connection, but you crave invisibility. You want to share, but you want to disappear. This is why so many early millennials cycle between oversharing and total withdrawal. It's not inconsistency. It's the brain trying to balance two incompatible needs, the need to be seen and the need to be left alone. But here's the part nobody tells you. You were raised by people who believed in institutions, in marriage, in careers, in homeownership, in the idea that life followed a script: school, job, house, family, retirement. And even if your parents struggled, even if their lives didn't match the script, they still believed in it. They still passed it down. But you came of age during a time when institutions were collapsing, when companies laid off thousands without warning, when banks failed, when marriages ended more often than they lasted, when buying a house became financially impossible for most people, when retirement felt like a myth. So your brain learned not to trust systems, not to rely on anything external. And instead of building your life around institutions, you built it around yourself, your skills, your adaptability, your ability to pivot. This isn't narcissism, it's survival. When the world stops being stable, the only thing left to invest in is you. But that creates a strange kind of loneliness, because the self is a fragile thing to build a life on. It's not steady, it's not predictable. And when you're the only thing holding yourself together, there's no room to fall apart. This is why so many early millennials struggle with burnout. Not because they're weak, but because they're holding weight that previous generations distributed across multiple structures. You're your own safety net, your own retirement plan, your own HR department, your own therapist, and the brain wasn't designed to carry all of that alone. You were the last generation to experience childhood without constant supervision, to ride bikes without helmets, to walk to school alone, to spend hours outside without checking in. And that gave you something rare, a sense of autonomy, a belief that you could figure things out, that you were capable of navigating the world without constant guidance. But you were also the first generation to grow up under the shadow of fear. School shootings, stranger danger, the rise of helicopter parenting, 9/11, the war on terror. Suddenly, the world was dangerous in a way it hadn't been before, or at least in a way that was now constantly visible. So you internalize two contradictory messages: you're independent, but the world is unsafe. You're capable, but you need to be careful. You're free, but you should be afraid. This creates a psychological pattern that shows up everywhere. You want adventure, but you overthink every risk. You want spontaneity, but you need a backup plan. You want to trust people, but you've learned to protect yourself first. It's not paranoia, it's the result of growing up in a world that told you to be both brave and vigilant at the same time. And this is why so many early millennials feel like they're always waiting for the other shoe to drop. Because they were taught that safety is temporary, that things can fall apart without warning, that even when things are good, you should be prepared for them to go bad. As you've gotten older, something has shifted. The behaviors that once felt like survival strategies now feel like patterns you can't break. The adaptability that helped you navigate chaos now feels like an inability to commit. The independence that made you resilient now feels like isolation. The caution that kept you safe now feels like fear. But here's what's actually happening. You're not stuck. You're just reaching the age where the strategies that got you here no longer serve you the same way. And your brain is trying to figure out what comes next. Because early millennials are entering midlife now. And midlife is when the brain starts asking different questions. Not how do I survive, but what do I actually want? Not how do I adapt, but what do I need to let go of? This is the identity shift. The moment when you realize that being adaptable doesn't mean you have to keep changing. That being independent doesn't mean you have to do everything alone. That being cautious doesn't mean you have to live in fear. At the core of it all, the behaviors you've developed, the flexibility, the caution, the self-reliance, they're not flaws. They're regulation strategies. They're the brain's way of creating stability in a world that refuses to be stable. You retreat because it gives you control. You plan because it reduces uncertainty. You keep your options open because closing doors feels permanent. You hold back because vulnerability has been punished before. These aren't signs that something is wrong with you. They're signs that your brain has been working overtime to keep you safe, to protect you from a world that promised one thing and delivered another. And maybe that's what early millennials need to hear most, that you're not broken, that the exhaustion you feel isn't personal failure, that the tension between who you were told to be and who you've become isn't confusion, it's clarity. You were raised for a world that no longer exists, and you've spent your entire adult life building a new one. That's not weakness, that's remarkable. You don't need to fix yourself. You just need to understand that your psychology makes sense, that the way you move through the world is a direct response to the world you've moved through. And maybe, finally, that's enough.